Hi, everybody. How are y'all doing?
All right.
Everything look good on your end?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly fine. It's great.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's Bettina said, I'm Jim Lee from Sumter, South Carolina, down here in good old USA. And I've been studying geoengineering, weather modification, space weather modification, and artificial clouds, aka plane farts, for over 15 years. And I find the more that I learn about it, the less I actually think I know about it. It's just crazy. And I'm sure that you guys probably have a lot of questions. And I would love to be able to answer some of those. Um, but first, I kind of want to just, let's obviously this group, you're here because you want to take some action. And I say, you've already taken the first step. Bravo to you, um, for, being involved, wanting to learn, and wanting to change the world, because that's literally the purpose of what we're doing here. Um, you know, the sayings on the website, never forget that a small group of dedicated individuals can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has, and you're part of that. So bravo to you. Geoengineering, what we see over our house every day, is not new by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the term geoengineering was first coined back in 1977. I could even go back to the days of John F. Kennedy and reports where geoengineering were first mentioned. You can actually see, if you go to climateviewer.com and you click on timeline, it'll take you to weathermodificationhistory.com, and you can see that wanting to control the weather, these attempts, they started in the mid 1800s, and they've only progressed since. And just this past February, the United Nations published a paper called One Atmosphere. In that paper, they lay out a roadmap, if you will, for global deployment of geoengineering. Now, between that and George Soros talking about funding the creation of clouds over the Arctic to cool the planet, one has to kind of unpack what geoengineering really means these days. So, as with anything that has come to the public's attention, they want to hide it and obscure it through semantics. So, what was once called geoengineering was then rebranded climate climate engineering, because even though Cesare Marchetti in 1977 was specifically calling geoengineering a way of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, which transitioned to what was known as solar radiation management, or a stratospheric aerosol injection, that became geoengineering as well. But geo implies Earth, whereas they want to engineer the climate. So they said, good idea. Let's rename it climate engineering. But then Dr. Alan Robach, while meeting with a bunch of these nerds and PhDs, or as I like to call them, people hiding behind diplomas, they were all sitting in a room deciding what the temperature of the planet should be and how to control it. And Alan remarked that he found it ironic that they were discussing how to control the temperature of the planet, but they were all sweating their butts off because they couldn't control the temperature of the room they were in because the air conditioner was broken. This is a foreboding sign for the entire geoengineering idea, let alone climate engineering. So the word engineering implies human, hands creating something. And as we all know, anybody who's owned a car, engineering go bad. And when engineering go bad, it could cost you your life. Literally, ever have a tire fly off at 70 miles an hour? Well, imagine that on a worldwide scale with our climate. So they wanted to rename it once again climate intervention. as if the Earth had a crack habit, or was addicted to methamphetamines and needed an intervention, or the fact that we're actually going to intervene in the climate to step in and change what Mother Nature, what God has controlled since the planet was created. So climate intervention is their latest terminology. I even heard one wacko refer to it as climate restoration. But this all stems from the latest push. 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted. And when the Mount Pinatubo eruption occurred, they noticed that a whole bunch of sulfur got shot into the stratosphere. And as a result of that one volcano and the subsequent drop in global temperature, at the Lawrence Livermore National Labs, Dr. Evil himself, Lowell Wood, along with Edward Teller and Roderick Hyde, started the modern push for geoengineering with the idea of stratospheric aerosol injections using sulfur, spraying sulfur into the stratosphere. They want to mimic volcanoes to block out the sun to cool the planet. So one has to ask yourself, when you're watching these planes crisscross your skies and make cirrus clouds, ice clouds, is that geoengineering? The answer is definitively yes. Chuck Long from the Earth Systems Research Lab at NOAA, one of the most highly regarded atmospheric scientists in the world, said so himself in a paper where he asked about clear sky brightening. And he said specifically that it wasn't even the clouds that you see coming out of planes. It wasn't even the lines that you're seeing in the sky and the clouds they make that's geoengineering, but a subvisual ice haze that whitens the sky. And you have to really think on this one for a moment. So in reality, every plane fart is filled with not only a cloud seed, because cloud seeding is what they do in weather modification. They use silver iodide. Water sticks to the silver iodide. That is what it is, the initial seed that makes the cloud. And eventually, when enough water sticks to that seed, it falls as rain. That's rainfall enhancement. That's the idea of cloud seeding. The same is true of aircraft. Whenever a jet fuel is burnt, out the back of that plane comes carbon black dust and soot. That soot is filled with metals. It is also coated in sulfur, and that sulfur transitions into sulfuric acid. And the Indian Space Organization found that at 18,000 kilometers, there was more than 10,000 specks or cloud seeds that came from planes, black carbon dust, at 18,000 kilometers. And the only source that they could determine that it was possible to come from was planes. So not only are planes flying well below that, that tells us that jet exhaust is transporting sulfur into the stratosphere and is geoengineering, and that it creates an ice haze that whitens the sky. And Chuck Long from the Earth Systems Research Lab said so himself with direct measurements. So what we have today is a combination of cloud creation or artificial clouds, or as the scholars would say, aviation-induced cloudiness, contrail-induced cirrus. They have many terms for what you're seeing, but at the end of the day, it is geoengineering. Both are geoengineering. One, you can look directly above your head, and even on the bluest day, it may be deep blue directly overhead. And then when you look off to the horizon, it'll be milky white. How many people in the room have noticed this? That is what Chuck Long was referring to as clear sky brightening. That's what geoengineering will look like if the United Nations gets its way, if the globalists and the technocrats are allowed to legalize geoengineering and dump way more chemicals into the stratosphere. It will only get whiter. Your future's so bright, you're gonna need shades. And their artificial shade for the planet will not suffice. So I get a question a lot on my YouTube channel. It's at Climate Viewer on YouTube. I get this in my emails all the time. Jim, I used to see the sun was bright yellow to dark, yellow bordering on orange. It seems white today. Am I crazy? You are not. This is caused by subvisual ice haze that causes diffuse light scattering, that causes all kinds of changes to the way light reaches the surface of the earth. So not only is our sun becoming whiter in appearance, the sky is becoming milky white. We have, a friend of mine wrote a rap song, Digital Clouds, and he called them the sky is full of white snakes and digital clouds. And those white snakes are fanning out in whether they want to call them persistent contrails or whatever term they come up with. At the end of the day, when those lines fan out, they become cirrus clouds. The cirrus clouds are specifically ice clouds. And when Ulrich Lohmann and a group of people from Finland flew up into those ice clouds and captured the cloud seeds, remember the terminology we talked about earlier, when they captured the little morsels, the little nuggets that all the ice had built up on, they found that 75% of those cloud seeds were man-made metals. My firewall's kicking off. Be gone, bad government actors. All right. We shall continue despite their attempts for shenanigans. So at the end of the day, 75% man-made metals found in cirrus clouds, sulfuric acid coming out of planes, making its way into the stratosphere, and the United Nations trying to legalize not only geoengineering experiments, but global deployment and global governance. One has to ask the most obvious question: what is the real purpose here? Is it really because they're so scared of global warming that they want to cool the planet? Do they really want to mimic volcanoes by spraying chemicals to save us from global warming? And I would say resoundingly the answer is no. If you look at the movement of technocracy, which started in the early 1930s, at the heart of every globalist is a technocrat. And a technocrat is one who would seek to have a one world government run by the scientific method, ruled by unelected officials who control all resources on the planet, including the number one resource on the planet, humans. So between human resources, water and food and energy, they want to be able to control it all. And they can do that by spying through every control mechanism possible: mass media, mind control, manipulation, slave speak, through, Joseph Stalin said, ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? So in that, you will quickly be referred to as a conspiracy theorist or a chemtard or, one of those chemtrail people if you try to talk about the most visible climate change there is. And that's planes farting all over the sky, changing the weather on a daily basis. And eventually, over the past 60, 70 years, changing the entire climate of the globe. Now, of course, I could go on ad nauseum about all the finer details, but I want to leave you with that broad kind of understanding of specifically just the airline industry. And I'm going to flip it real quick and then open, I would prefer to answer questions than monologue any day. But I want you to just propose this to you. On weathermodificationhistory.com, there are 3 different Freedom of Information Act requests. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and China Lake Naval Warfare Center, both of which were involved in weather warfare in Vietnam. So back in the 1969 through 73, there was Operation Popeye, and both of these institutions, the United States Air Force and the United States Naval Research Lab, in concert with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and everybody's favorite fun guy, Henry Kissinger, they decided to do weather warfare with the approval of President Lyndon Johnson. And their slogan was "Make mud, not war," kind of a throwback to the hippie movement of the same time, where they said "Make love, not war." Make mud, not war was the idea that they would dump silver iodide and lead iodide into the monsoon rains over Vietnam to make the Ho Chi Minh Trail unpassable, to make the monsoon rains so bad that it would wash out the Viet Cong. And anybody who's seen movies like Forrest Gump or any documentary where you see soldiers up to their waist in water knows what weather warfare looks like. So in 1994, I came across 3 separate Freedom of Information Act requests that were brought by the sunshineproject.org. This website is no longer available on the internet. I do a lot of trolling on archive.org, aka the Wayback Machine, and I look for deleted websites. And in addition to the sunshine-project.org website, I found a presentation by Dr. Arnold J. Barnes from the United States Air Force Phillips Laboratory at Hanscom Air Force Base, who said the same thing. All 3 of these, the Freedom of Information Act request and Dr. Arnold Barnes from the U.S. Air Force Phillips Lab, said, we want to control the weather using carbon black dust. The exact same thing that comes out of commercial aviation, the same stuff. But it gets a little deeper when you look back through our newspaper vault on weather modification history. Back in 1958, Dr. Florence Van Straten, that's correct, it was a lady doctor who worked for the United States Navy. She was able to create and destroy clouds using carbon black dust. 1958. This is by no stretch of the imagination a new technology. She said that they were able to create 1-mile long clouds with carbon black dust suspended in a liquid. They were able to make puffy clouds just by dumping dry carbon black dust out of the back of planes. And they were able to destroy or eliminate those clouds using the same carbon black dust, because that's called overseeding. If there are too many seeds in the sky and not enough water vapor for them to stick to, then you actually can shut rain off. So not only can they create floods, they can create droughts. In those Freedom of Information Act requests and in Dr. Arnold Barnes' presentation, he said, current capabilities, 1997, create/suppress contrails / cirrus. But he told us why. He said the military does it for two purposes. One, to block out spy satellites in space. Think about it. Why would the military create a bunch of clouds? Well, if China or Russia has a spy satellite that's going to be coming over, and you've got your brand new top secret stealth fighter that you want to do some test flights on, or it's going to be out on the runway, you could just make clouds and block the sky out. In fact, back in the 1970s, the Russians were able to create what they called infrared defeating clouds. So not even on an infrared spectrum, not just visual satellites, but even infrared that could like pierce through clouds, that they could create clouds that could block out all spectrums of light, to block out satellites in space. The other reason that he gave for creating clouds was to improve the ability for nighttime operations, like the United States military did in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Desert Storm. When we marched all of our troops in there, it was surprising to most people who were watching the news to see the Iraqi Republican Guard all coming out with their hands up in under 10 days. It's the worst beatdown in the history of warfare. And people had to ask themselves how and why. I mean, were we just that good? But when you think about not only what they called calmatives, the fact that they have all types of bioweapons that they can deploy despite, bioweapons being banned. Look up the gay bomb if you want a really, good laugh and cry at the same time. The idea that they would make a chemical they could spray on the battlefield to make Iraqi soldiers gay. So they're so busy and mad in love with each other that they just throw their weapons down and don't want to fight. It's a real thing. That's what makes it scary and funny at the same time. But they could easily cover the entire country of Iraq in clouds, and in a very black night with A-10 warthogs raining down 30 millimeter shells and dropping bombs, and all of our soldiers geared to the teeth with night vision goggles, those poor Iraqis never stood a chance. All because of clouds and a lot of psychological warfare. There was a lot going on there, but the clouds, they help. When you have night vision goggles and your enemy does not, when it's dark, you just hold your hand out in front of you. You can't see that. You're certainly not going to be able to shoot at the enemy. You're a sitting duck. These are the reasons why the military creates clouds, in addition to John Brennan from the CIA. Oh, there he goes again. It's the CIA and weather warfare in Vietnam. It's the CIA trying to kill Castro's crops because they didn't like Fidel Castro. So they made the rain fall in the Gulf of Mexico, not on the country of Cuba. That is a man-made created drought using cloud seeding. In Vietnam, they made floods. In Cuba in 1969, they made drought. And the idea was that if they killed Castro's sugar crops, they would kill his money. Economic warfare through weather warfare, brought to you by the CIA. So is it any surprise that today, John Brennan, when he was in charge of the CIA, was talking at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he said, "It has come to my attention that geoengineering is a pretty badass idea, and we'd like to do it." So you're not a conspiracy theorist, and those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. I would strongly advocate for action against the airline industry, specifically commercial aviation, and the pollution that comes from jet fuel being burned that creates clouds that alter our weather and climate and transports sulfur into the stratosphere. That's a big problem. And simultaneously recognizing that military and government agencies also intentionally create clouds, have stated why they do it, and have said, we're very concerned about climate change due to destabilization. At the same time, many journals and many online, websites have said that because of the weather warfare ban of 1978 that followed Vietnam and the disclosure of the weather warfare that happened there, this was called the Environmental Modification Convention. It was signed ratified in 1978. Russia and China were the heads of the signatories, and they agreed to not do weather warfare. However, there is no way to actually catch somebody doing weather warfare, which is why I've proposed something called the Environmental Modification Accountability Act. And it's an addendum, an add-on, a way to trust but verify, to give teeth to the weather warfare ban of 1978, to create a sensor network worldwide, one run by the government and militaries, and one run by the people. That's right. I hope to one day build a climate viewer for your own backyard to collect rainfall samples, to be able to monitor for the telltale signatures, chemicals that are used in weather modification. And when we find them in your rain, you'll know that something has happened. But it's going to take a monumental effort to push back against military and government institutions that are dedicated to weather warfare, weather control, and ultimately climate engineering, climate intervention, or geoengineering. Because when the United States military did the zinc cadmium sulfide spraying of 1950s, and they were simulating nuclear fallout by spraying zinc cadmium sulfide from planes all the way from California to Washington, D.C., from coast to coast, Operation Large Area Coverage. You can look this stuff up. It's the Manhattan-Rochester Coalition, as it was known. They did well over 1,000 different sprayings of radioactive material and followed people for more than 40 and 50 years to their death. And when they died, they got their thyroids and ground them up to find out how much of that radioactive dust was in their thyroids. This was a secret for over 70 years. I want that to sink in. So while you're thinking about, how do I get the damn military and how do I put an end to all this? They were able to keep something on that monumental of a scale secret for over 70 years. I will not be surprised at the age of 46 right now that on my deathbed, I'm going to have some young kid who, followed my work, or, get an email from a friend of a friend who's going to be like, hey, the government just admitted that they started geoengineering back in 2008 and they've been doing it ever since. And like, son of a bitch, I knew I was right. But that's the world we live in. That's the reality we face. So what I tell people who are pragmatic and they want a solution, act on what you know now. And what we know, we prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that the airline industry is geoengineering. Whether it's intentional or not, I would lean way more towards intentional at this point. Maybe not over the last 40 years, but certainly within the last 20. And you can read all the documentation you want about it. I tend to just throw it all into the artificial clouds section of my website. I think it's the most accurate term for it. And you'll see things like I interviewed the Dr. Rangasai Halthori from the Federal Aviation Administration, Aviation Climate Change Research Initiative. Oh, it's a mouthful and a tongue twister. But he's the head of all things aviation and climate change. And he said, we want more clouds by day, none by night. You can't get much clearer than that. When the head of the Federal Aviation Administration says, hey, we know you guys don't like us making clouds, but guess what? We want more clouds. We just don't want them at nighttime because they heat the planet like a blanket. They are the greenhouse. We want to melt them away at night, but we want more clouds during the day. So screw all you guys who say you don't want them. And if you use the C word, we're going to use the C word back at you. You say chemtrail, we'll say conspiracy theorist. But it's not a conspiracy theory. It's conspiracy fact. And with that, I'll gladly take any questions.
Is there anybody? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for now.
I figured I would change it up, Bettina, instead of just monologuing about my solution. Try to mix some other stuff in there.